You don't hear me okay. How loud do I have to speak? Nice acoustics in this lovely new building. So thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much to Earth Commons for having me here. It's really a pleasure to wander over from the Law Center. I'm located in the 501st Street building on the law campus of our now Capitol campus. So I'm thrilled for an excuse to come over and see you all. I'm thrilled to have you all join us at the Capitol campus. It's really exciting to have all of these programs here in one place. And your building is lovely. I'm over here more often. So thank you for having me. Before I dig into the subnational climate policy talk, I would like to say a few words about the Georgetown Climate Center, because I'm guessing that many of you may not know much about us, and I would really like you to. So I'm the executive director. I've been in that role for about 4 years. As I mentioned, I spent about a decade there. When we first started, we launched in 2008. Actually, we've been around one of the older centers and institutes at the Law Center. And we were started by our founding director, Vicki Arroyo, who's now a professor from practice at the Law Center, and our founding faculty director, Lisa Einzerling, who is a faculty member at the Law Center. We are now really thrilled to welcome a brand new faculty director, not new to the Law Center, but new to the Climate Center. Mr. Bill Busby is joining us now as our new faculty director, as our prior faculty director just retired from the Law Center. We're really sorry to lose him as well. So we were started in 2008 by state leaders who were looking at activity happening on the Hill, happening in Washington, D.C. All of this swirl of talk about climate change policy, climate change legislation, and really wanting to know what that process was going to mean for them, their policies, for their programs. They wanted sort of a window and a view and a voice into the relationships between government. Our original name was actually the Georgetown State Federal Climate Resource Center. We decided at some point that was really a mouthful for our everyday logo name, but it really does speak to what we are and what we do. We are a resource. We're not advocates, we're not lobbyists. We provide research and analysis to policymakers, really focused on that nexus of state and federal policymaking. And we'll work with folks at every level of government. Domestic policy focused, US focused, but federal, state, local, whoever's looking for advice, input, resources, information to help them advance climate policy, we are happy to work with them. One more framing note, we work on two big pots of policy areas. We work on both mitigation, reducing the emissions that cause climate change, and we also work on adaptation, preparing for and responding to the impacts of climate change. And those are really parallel, co-equal branches of our program. From the very beginning, insisted those are both really important pieces of this puzzle. All right, a couple other things about me real quick, because I hope you'll join us. I teach an energy law class at the Law Center. I also teach a climate change practicum class at the Law Center, where we do really applied projects on the ground with policymakers at the state and local and sometimes federal government. Those classes are open to non-law students if you want to come take them. We also have research assistants at the Climate Center. Again, many law students, but not all law students. So during the school year, during the summer, we invite students to come and apply for one of our RA positions, and you get to work on all of the fabulous projects that we do. It's a really great way to get a window into some applied work right here on your campus. We have a fabulous staff of lawyers and engineers and scientists and policy experts and kind of everything you can think of that works on climate change. We're at the law school. We do a lot of law. We do a lot of other stuff too. It's really all very interdisciplinary and intertwined. And again, what we focus on is really this intersecting roles of state and federal government. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I can't think of any more timely moment to be trying to figure out what the intersecting roles are between state and federal and also local governments. It is all very dynamic and very fast changing, and to me, very interesting. And I hope to convince you of the same. So in talking about our work, I'm going to do a little bit of a history lesson about US climate change policy and the ways in which the state and local and federal actors have interacted with each other. That kind of brings us to where we are now. So a little bit of history. I forgot to click. Here's who we are. Here's what we do. This is us working with students and faculty and practitioners out in the field in meetings and conversations and presentations and all sorts of fun stuff. All right, so When I started working on this issue about 20 some years ago, climate change in the US was a fairly bipartisan issue, which is a really weird thing to say today. But when I started doing this, there were bills in Congress that we were actively focused on, using comprehensive climate policy, multi-sector, across the economy, capping emissions on greenhouse gases, co-sponsored by both Democratic and Republican members of Congress and both the House and the Senate. It was not universally beloved, or we would have passed them, but it was very bipartisan. It was not the level of controversy you see today. When President George W. Bush ran for office in 2000, he made a campaign pledge to reduce emissions from carbon emissions from power plants. He didn't actually end up doing that, but it was part of his campaign pledge. In 2008, both candidates, Senator Barack Obama, Senator John McCain, both ran with campaign platforms that involved dealing with climate change. This was a bipartisan issue from many parts of the government. One of the first things that we did at the Climate Center when we started, spun up in 2009, was to support state governors in writing a letter. This is a picture of the letter. It's framed on my desk, actually. This is a letter that was drafted and signed by over 30 governors. All of these governors, there's some territories in there, so it's not 30 out of 50, it's 30 out of 50 something. But this is a bipartisan letter of many governors committed to two principles, and you can't read them from where you sit, so I'll tell you what they say. The first one is a support by the governors of federal action to address climate change, to advance clean energy, and to reduce emissions from climate change at the federal level, bipartisan. The second piece of this statement that is in the second paragraph there is about their desire for states to play a really fundamental key role in the design of the framework, the regulatory structure that got spun up to address climate change. So they're supporting federal action, but they also want a role in what that looks like. And that's really very common. That's really the way a lot of our environmental and energy laws work. And we want it to work this way here as well. And that concept has been at the core of pretty much everything that we have done in every area we have worked ever since then. So I mentioned that when we first started, the activity was on the Hill. There were bills, there was a conversation, they were capping emissions. They're, by the way, also investing in adaptation and resilience, technology incentives, big federal programs. And one of the big questions in that federal conversation was what to do about state policies, state programs. It was a big decision. Do we let these state programs flourish? Do we let them keep going? Or do we preempt them? Do we decide we don't need that? We have one big federal program. That's all we need. Forget the states. It's a messy system. Let's just one program. And the question was really important. And the question was important because we weren't starting from a blank slate. There were lots of states that had active programs that they were concerned with maintaining all over the country. So let's look at a few of the maps, what was going on in the country when this conversation was happening. So this is a map of states that, this is current map, so there weren't quite this many in 2009 or 10 or so, but there were a lot. These are states that have clean energy or renewable energy standards. You'll notice a couple of things about this map. One, it's not as red-blue divided as you might guess it is. There are actually states all over the country for various reasons that have passed these renewable energy or clean energy standards. And they've done them for decades. The first one was actually Iowa in 1983. Connecticut and Maine and Massachusetts adopted their standards in the late 1990s, but so did Texas and Nevada and Wisconsin. This is really, again, a bipartisan sort of system. And one of the reasons that you see this all over the country is that these programs are all tailored. They're tailored to state priorities and state needs and state interests. They set different targets at different dates. They include different kinds of energy in the mix of what counts. So they're very sort of personalized for the state that they're in. Other things states are doing at the time. These are states that have state greenhouse gas reduction targets. You might notice about this map, it's a little bit more drawn along the political red-blue lines that we see lots of things in the country drawn along, but not entirely. They were passed through a variety of mechanisms. Some of these are in statute, some of these are in governor's executive orders. If you see one that looks surprisingly colored in when you're wondering why in the world would a state with those politics have one of these standards, it's in many cases an executive order issued by a governor's office. So there are political dimensions that come into play here. But still, quite a lot of states around the country are doing this. Some of these states develop pretty extensive regulatory programs, not just a number in a statute aiming for, but a real structure of program designed to achieve them. One that you probably hear most about if you follow US state policy is California. They are often at the forefront of a lot of these innovative policies. And California in 2008 passed a Global Warming Solutions Act, which required their Air Resources Board to develop regulations and market mechanisms to reduce California's greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020, which is a 30% reduction at the time. That was one of the earlier, like really comprehensive in statute programs that spun up multiple regulatory programs underneath that target. Around the same time, 2009, we saw the launch of a multi-state initiative in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. All the states from Maine through Maryland developed a program called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This was a program that is multi-state, but it's really interesting. Each state runs its own program. It's not like one big thing run by some sort of mega state entity. There is no mega state entity. Each state can adopt its own programs. So they all adopted the same program. And they all got together and agreed that they would make their programs accept allowances from each other's programs so they could essentially function as a big multi-state system. It's really very elegantly designed, in my opinion. But they got together and did this, launched it in 2009. It's about a dozen states now. A couple kind of come in and out. And again, that was led by a bipartisan governors. Governor Pataki of New York was one of the spearheaders of that project when it first started in the early 2000s. There were similar conversations to the RGGI, the Regional Gas Initiative conversation, happening in the Western states, similar conversations happening in the Midwestern states. There were lots of parts of the country that were talking about this. And we were even supporting conversations among them to talk to each other across the regions about how they might link these all together into this sort of multi-part moving toward national system, kind of bottom up instead of top down. Those were really fun conversations. But you might look at this map or that map or any of these maps and think, that's a lot of different policies in a lot of different places. Here we're sitting in a business school. A lot of times in the business school, you think, boy, that's a lot of regulations for different companies who are trying to operate in the system to meet. How do they figure all that out? How do they navigate? Don't we want one big system? We talk at the law school a lot about states being laboratories for democracy, having these innovative policies where they can try out new things. But you might wonder if maybe once we've had a few lab experiments, should we stop experimenting and like pick one that works and use it everywhere and use it systemically? There was a real argument against this, what was called a patchwork of state policies that were confusing for regulated entities to try to navigate. And so part of the discussion on the Hill was whether we should preempt these state policies, all these things the states were doing. Do we just shut them down and trade them for a big federal program? And like I said, there's some logic to that. But we at the Climate Center and the states that we were working with and some legal scholars that we were working with and others were arguing at the time that there was real value to maintaining roles for both. Roles for federal actors, roles for state actors, roles for local actors. In letting there be a system where there's a federal floor that determines sort of the baseline minimum that everyone can do, but then gives states space to go farther, gives them space to innovate, gives them space to try something a little bit different on top, gives them space to go a little bit farther than the federal government is going. There's this idea of cooperative federalism that is baked into many of our statutes. So this is not, it's not a new idea, but the idea of a system of state federal sharing of responsibilities, whether it's money or regulations, kind of working together to achieve policy goals. A couple places where this works already now in the system that we have. So one example that we've spent a lot of time looking at the Climate Center is federal transportation and infrastructure law. The way that our federal transportation funding system works, most of our federal bill on transportation is really largely a funding, infrastructure funding package. It's money. It's money that starts at the federal government and it moves basically through the US Department of Transportation to state departments of transportation. And the states are the ones who really figure out how to spend that federal money. Another example, the Clean Air Act. I'll talk in a minute about regulations adopted under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. Those are a place in which EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the US EPA, is directed to set guidelines at the federal level that states are then charged with developing plans to implement. States figure out how to reach the federal guidelines, and they're approved by EPA, they're approved by the federal government. But the states really have a really prominent role in figuring out how to tailor the achievement of those goals to meet their own state's needs. Last example, the Federal Power Act, the energy statute that much of this is governed by, and the electricity system. A lot of our emissions policy has been on power plants. The Federal Power Act establishes the federal government as the regulator of interstate wholesale energy markets and interstate transmission. Everything else is left to states. States have the authority to regulate in all the areas that the federal government doesn't. And there's a lot of space left for states here. So we said, do the same thing for climate. Give them space, give them opportunities to work, and keep doing these programs. And let it all sort of be one big picture. So the way that bill ended up working in this particular detail is that it carved out some time. It preempted the states for about 5 years or so and said, hold on those state programs for now. Let us get this off the ground. We get the federal program off the ground, see what happens. Long story short, we did not get that federal bill that we were working really hard on for a few years. A bill passed the House of Representatives, the Waxman-Markey bill, passed in June of 2009. It stalled in the Senate, did not pass the Senate. There was a big focus in the Senate at the time on healthcare and what became the Affordable Care Act, and that would have been two really big bills to try to move at the same time. So we got a healthcare bill. We did not get a climate bill. So after all of that, what happened? What do we do next? We didn't stop thinking about national policy. We didn't stop thinking about state policy either. The question became among people trying to figure out, okay, well now what? Well, what else have we got? We've got states. We've still got states, and we've still got the existing laws and regulatory systems that we have in place at EPA already. So what do those look like? Turns out they are also very state federal. So what happened at the federal level? First thing that happened is that as President Obama came into office, there had been a recent decision at the Supreme Court that was really critical for all of this conversation. And in 2007, the Supreme Court ruled a case that you may have heard about called Massachusetts versus EPA, which essentially said that EPA had the authority through the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, that they counted as air pollution. And that because they counted as air pollution, EPA had to, not just could, but had to explore whether or not EPA found, the administrator found, that greenhouse gases from mobile sources, which was the subject of that particular case, endangered public health and welfare. And EPA went through this very lengthy scientific process. There were a ton of studies, ultimately found, and I think it was not super surprising, that greenhouse gases from mobile sources did in fact endanger public health and welfare. They released a 2009 endangerment finding saying so. Once they did that, the EPA got to start regulating greenhouse gas emissions for climate change. And they did. So this is the Obama administration coming in 2009. They did this endangerment finding. They started working on mobile source regulations. They started working on power plant regulations. Okay, we're good, right? We've got the two biggest sectors of the economy now covered by an active EPA who's working to regulate these. Don't need the states, right? No, states keep going. The states still continue with all of these policies they're working on. A few things going on. One, I mentioned states can pass their own energy laws and policies. They kept doing that like gangbusters. This is an update of some of those clean energy standards that I talked about. States not only kept passing these energy standards, they kept increasing them. So this is a map not of all the states that have clean energy standards, but of all the states that have 100% or net zero emissions energy standards. And it's a fair number. That's a really ambitious number. It is hard to get to 100. And so this is not just a, well, reduced by 20%, 30%. You can imagine some fairly incidental sort of reductions you can make to get some of those initial percentage points off. But to have a fundamental change in your energy system that's 100% clean is a really big shift. These are all states signing up for that. It's currently 24 states, plus District of Columbia that have all signed up for 100% clean standards. States can also still cap emissions from power plants. The Clean Air Act does not prevent them from doing that. It leaves that role for states. And for the states in RGGI, the program I mentioned in the Northeast, and California, and now Washington State, they're all actually doing that. They're still doing that. The Clean Air Act does, in fact, give EPA this authority to set these guidelines for states to develop plans to do it. So the next big thing we worked on after we stopped was regulation. And we spent a lot of time talking with state officials and NGOs, environmental groups, companies, sort of everybody who was trying to figure out what EPA should do to effectively design these guidelines to reduce emissions from power plants. And we spent a lot of time with states. These are pictures of letters that the states submitted that we helped the states draft and submit. They signed to EPA, providing their input. They had been running these programs. They had tried these programs. They had California and RGGI and these state energy standards, lots of practice doing this. And they had really substantive advice for EPA saying, this is what's worked for us. This is what hasn't worked for us. This is what's easy. This is what's hard. We really don't recommend you do that. We recommend you do this. Substantive input into the programs, but also inviting EPA to develop these guidelines in a way that they could use all these programs they had developed to support advancing these guidelines. They wanted to make sense with all their current work and regulations and policies that they put all this time and money into. So we were really involved in trying to help figure out what is a good way for this to fit together, these puzzle pieces at the state level, the federal level. How can they mesh well? And the states put in all kinds of input, and that was really fun to talk about. Long story short, again, if you know about the history of these regulations, they were challenged in court by states and others who opposed this regulation. Ultimately, the Supreme Court, in a case called West Virginia versus EPA, found in 2022 that the approach that EPA had taken in this Clean Power Plan was outside the bounds of their authority. They also know that in the time between the finalization of those rules in 2015 and the court case decision in 2022, lots of things happened in the meantime. For one thing, the administration changed. Right? So the Obama's administration Clean Power Plan was already in the process of being replaced by a Trump administration Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which was also challenged in court and ultimately struck down by another court. When the Biden administration came in, they replaced the Trump rules with another approach. It was not the same as the Obama approach, given the guidance from the Supreme Court, but also trying to advance regulations to reduce emissions from power plants. In June of this year, just a few months ago, the Trump EPA proposed to repeal all greenhouse gas emission standards for the power sector under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. So we're bouncing back and forth, right? Rules and then different rules and then different rules and then different rules, maybe no rules. It's dizzying and frustrating. But guess what? For all this time, the states are still doing this. So back to the point about, do we want to sort of let these states percolate and do all these things? They kept going and they kept developing stronger and stronger, more ambitious, different kinds of programs. They kept refining these programs too. They would review the programs and tweak the rules a little bit and make them a little better at this or better at that. So we saw innovation along the way in the state programs. Just this week, California legislators announced a deal with the governor to extend California's greenhouse gas reduction program through 2045. They're still going. The RGGI program that I keep mentioning in the Northeast has their 70th program auction coming up soon this year. The Washington State program just had their third, I think. They've been going for about 2 years now and made it through a ballot initiative in November that would have had voters repeal the program, but that did not succeed. Transportation sector is now the largest source of emissions in the US. And the Clean Air Act does largely preempt states from doing anything about regulating emissions from motor vehicles. It treats power plants and vehicles differently in the statute, but not entirely. One thing the Clean Air Act does, in this kind of funny provision, is it lets California, the state of California, and only the state of California, because they had been putting in place regulations already. By the time the Clean Air Act was passed, California had rules in place already trying to deal with emissions from pollution from cars. So the Clean Air Act carves out California and says that California, doesn't say the name California, describes California in a way that only California actually meets. California can get a waiver from that preemption. They can write to EPA and they can say, we request to be waived from this preemption because we have a program that is at least as strong as the federal program that you all have. And we have these unique needs in California to regulate. And EPA shall, at that point, issue California a waiver that allows them to have their own program regulating emissions from coast. Once California does that, any other state in the country can choose to follow California's rules instead of the federal rules. So there's this really kind of interesting dynamic between the role that California can play separate from all the other states in not just driving their own regulations, but in leading the way for lots of states to follow them and adopting stronger regulations. And so during the Bush administration, California had been requesting a waiver and not receiving a waiver. But when the Obama administration came in, they did a few things on cars too, following the Mass versus EPA case that I mentioned, which told them to go do an endangerment finding, and if they found endangerment, to start regulating emissions from vehicles. So one thing they did was they gave California their waiver. They said, okay, you have made your case, you have regulations that are stronger than our federal ones, and you have these unique California circumstances, so sure. California then started adopting stronger, more ambitious greenhouse gas standards, really at the time the only greenhouse gas standards for vehicles, as the Obama administration started to work on the federal standards. And a really interesting thing happened in this process. The dynamic between a federal administration that was interested in adopting these standards and a state that had the power to adopt more ambitious standards and to bring other states along. At the time, there were about 13 states that said they wanted to follow the California rules when they adopted. Led to a really interesting political conversation with the automakers, who at that point were faced with not a lot of options for preventing this new wave of regulation to come. And there was this ceremony at the Rose Garden in 2009, where President Obama stood with the regulators from both U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. EPA, and from California, and from the car companies, all together, this sort of happy moment where they all announced they're going to work together to talk about what these standards should be in a harmonized way. They're going to harmonize the California standards with the federal EPA emission standards, with a separate set of standards that the U.S. Department of Transportation issues for fuel economy, which are a different statute and a different regulation, but have a lot of implications that relate in similar ways for the car companies. And so they got them all to work together. The idea of the patchwork, we don't have to worry about because they're all going to have one big set of regulations. But that regulation is really influenced by the pull that California exerts on this because they're at that table, because they're part of the conversation. So you can kind of see how this interplay between having the states keep doing stuff while you have a federal program can lead to some really interesting dynamics and conversations. So the Obama administration did those regulations. Big surprise again, spoiler, the Trump administration came in and changed them all. Biden administration came in and changed them all again. So again, we're seeing this federal framework that we looks pretty stable in statute. It's a regulatory process that we go through, but in practice has had a hard time really giving the stability to keep going in a certain policy direction that's been changing as we get these new administrations coming in. But the states keep going. So in addition to these vehicle standards, the states have been pursuing a number of other transportation policies. They have incentive programs for electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. They have fuels policies. We do have many states, I think it's now 17 states have, as of now, adopted California's LEV and ZEV emission vehicles and zero emission vehicles standards. This is a big question mark right now. You might have guessed if the Trump administration came in and revoked the waiver that California had gotten. That's what they did in the prior administration. This time around, a new development. The Congress actually stepped into this one and voted for a resolution, a Congressional Review Act resolution, rescinding these waivers, which is a brand new thing that we didn't know could be done, but was done, was signed by the president. So Congress actually repealed the waiver for California's current vehicle standards, and the states, 10 of these states are currently suing the administration, arguing that's not a thing that we can do. But this is where the vehicle standards stand right now. We spent a bunch of time in the years of the last Trump administration working with a group of states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, trying to help them develop a multi-state fuels program that would have capped emissions from fuels and reduce those emissions in a way that raised money and brought the state's funding to invest in clean transportation infrastructure and other programs like electric vehicles and infrastructure and bicycling and pedestrian infrastructure and transit and fixing the roads and all sorts of other good stuff. That timing, so that didn't happen either. There's a lot that almost happened, didn't happen. That one didn't happen because all of a sudden the states had been thinking, boy, we really need this money, we really need this funding, we have this big transportation funding problem. And something appeared on the horizon. And the thing that appeared on the horizon was two pieces of legislation that passed somewhat by surprise for me, I will say, in 2021 and 22. We had the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which was really a transportation reauthorization bill. I mentioned that the transportation bills are dollars, they're funding, they're money that goes to state DOT. That bill in 2021 was about $1.2 trillion, well, over 5-6 years. Of that money, about half of that, about $600 billion, was transportation money, surface transportation money. And that money, as I mentioned before, is mostly flowing from the U.S. public transportation right through the states. So again, big federal program, big federal bill. DOT is all ready to make some good decisions about clean investments in transportation, but it's not up to them. This money's in the states. And so we ran an analysis in 2021. We've been really, oh, I forgot, I should not forget this part. Another thing states are doing before I move on, this is also really important, and a really cool report that we just issued. States are also working on adaptation. They're not just reducing emissions. They are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. They are feeling the impacts of climate change already. And even again, in places that are purple or maybe even red politically, they are trying to figure out how to prepare their communities for the impacts of climate change. So this is a report that we released earlier this year on chief resilience officers, which are a position that's growing in popularity in the states as they start to think about how governance around climate adaptation and resilience should work. How do we think about all the different systems in our states, our communities that are going to be faced with the impacts of flooding, of extreme heat, of wildfires, of storms, all of these things that they have to think about. And so one of the things that we found is that about a dozen states so far, it's still young as a concept, but a growing concept, are adopting these positions called state chief resilience officers. And they're putting them in really different places in the state. Some are in the governor's office, or they're in an environment agency, or they're in a transportation agency, commerce department. They sit in different places and they do different things and have somewhat different roles and responsibilities and levels of authority and access to dollars. And so this is a great report if you're interested in thinking about what states can do on resilience, adaptation. We can see some of these examples that are out there already. So states, again, moving forward in the absence of federal money or guidance. All right, so then what happened? We got a bunch of federal money. A bunch of federal money showed up and the states, oh, great, a bunch of federal money. Now what? So we ran this analysis in 2021 with some tools that we've been using to help states think about their own transportation money. And this is what happened when we invested the bipartisan infrastructure law money for just the first tranche of money. It's a couple of years worth of money into transportation infrastructure. And we ran a bunch of scenarios. And so, well, what if they spent all that money on like the good stuff? Like they spend it on things that reduce emissions. That's how I define good stuff. So let's say they spend it on repairing roads. Repairing roads actually reduces emissions. Say they spent it on transit. Say they spent it on electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Say they spent it on bike infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, all these things that give people choices to not drive around as much. If you do that in just the first few years of this program, you actually reduce emissions beyond the baseline. You add to the reductions we're getting from all these other programs at the state level, the federal level, the vehicle standards, all the things. We can get more out of just how we spend the federal money that we don't think of as climate money. We don't think of that as emissions money or clean energy money. We think of it as just road money, but the road money really matters and makes a big difference. On the other hand, if we spend that money on widening roads, if we add lanes, we add roads, we add lanes to existing roads, we increase emissions. And so the blue line here shows that when you spend this money, again, just the first couple of years, you decrease your emissions. If you spend the money on additional lanes, you actually increase emissions. So the more money we're pouring into the system, if we're spending it on roads, we're actually making our problem harder. And so we went to USDOT and the states and said, hey, everybody, how you spend this money really matters. And got a bunch of states who are really interested in this. And it's been really fun the last few years to meet with not just the state climate people, but the state transportation people and have them ask us for tools, data, information to help them think through, well, gee, how do we have climate goals, right? We're trying to reduce our emissions and now you're telling me that I'm making it worse. So helping them think through how they spend the money to get more on that reducing emissions side of the line than the increased emissions side of the line. Now, not every state cares about that. I'll be frank, some do, some don't. But it's really interesting to realize the connection between these different parts of the government and how their decisions, they may not think of themselves as part of this climate problem, but they are. So that was one of the big pieces of legislation that we spent a lot of time thinking about and that brought a lot of money to the states. The other one that you've probably heard more about as a climate bill is the Inflation Reduction Act. That was a bill passed in 2022, really a big tax incentive bill. There are grant programs, there are tax incentives. It's a broad energy investment and incentive package, along with a bunch of other things too. It's a really big tax package in general. And again, a big federal program, still a really big role for states in thinking about how these programs are run. Some of the incentives go directly to people or companies. Some of them go to states to manage to give out themselves, to figure out how to spend their own money. And this is an analysis. It was done of the Inflation Reduction Act by an analytical firm called the Road Group. And this slide really tells the story of what a big deal this bill was for the US climate action. I'll quote from this analysis that the Rhodium Group did. They said, this here, the IRA is a game changer for US decarbonization. We find that the package as a whole drives US net greenhouse gas emissions down to 32 to 43% below 2005 levels in 2030, compared to 24 to 35% without it. The long-term robust incentives and programs provide a decade of policy certainty for the clean energy industry to scale up across all corners of the US energy system to levels that the US has never seen before. Really big deal. And again, big pots of money, many of them either programs that states were applying for or states were in charge of giving out. States were in charge of helping their local governments apply for, figuring out what it meant for cities, figuring out what it meant for people who lived in their states. Everybody sort of ran over here and focused on this for a while. That brings us to today. We're caught up, except that you may have heard that in the last several months, there is a lot of uncertainty about all of these pots of money. Not so much the IIJA, the transportation bill, those are largely what they are. They're big formula pots of money that just go straight to states and the states spend them. The IRA programs have had a lot of turmoil and some of the BIL programs also. But you probably heard that the Trump administration has rescinded or paused many of these grant programs that were going to clean energy packages, incentives, programs, grants, investments. One example, in August, the EPA announced it's terminating the $7 billion Solar for All program. This is an IRA program that was designed to bring renewable energy to low-income communities. EPA had awarded Solar for All grants in August of last year to 49 state-level agencies, 6 tribes, and 5 multi-state award recipients. There are cancellations and terminations and pauses and questions like this really across these grant programs, across the administration, across the government. It's really complicated. It's really fast moving. In addition, we see Congress stepping in. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act pulled back a lot of the money that had been unobligated from these programs. It left programs there in general, but it took money that hadn't been spent back. We are now trying to help states figure out what this all means. If you're interested in details, I will recommend to you a web page that we've been developing with some explainers trying to keep track of what all these actions mean, especially for states. We see states as the people who we are most trying to inform and help navigate all of this. So we look at these developments from a lens, what does this mean for states and their ability to run the energy programs, the transportation programs, the adaptation programs, resilience programs, all of the things that they are trying to do to advance climate action. So where does that leave us? We have lots of reversals of funding. We have reversals of regulations. We have pulling back of dollars at a new scale, only because the funds were at a new scale. But there's one more thing that's different right now that we are thinking a lot about. And that's that unlike the prior Trump administration or the Bush administration, there's times when we weren't really seeing an active federal government wanting to address climate change. What happened then was that they just sort of stepped back. So you know what, this is not a thing we want to focus on. This is not a priority for our administration. And when they did, the state stepped forward. The state said, okay, fine, we got it. We'll keep going. We're doing it. We'll keep doing it. No problem. But that's a little bit different now. And so one thing that we have seen here is that the current Trump administration is not only ceding the field to the states, they're actually arguing that the states do not have the ability or to do a lot of things that I've shown you states have been doing. So in April, the Trump administration released an executive order called Protecting American Energy from State Overreach. So this executive order argues, and I'll quote again, that many states have enacted or in the process of enacting burdensome, there's some other things I'm going to cut here, burdensome climate change or energy policies that threaten American energy dominance and our economic and national security, unquote. It lists some of these policies specifically, calls out some of the states, calls out some of the policies. It also directs the Attorney General to identify state and local laws, regulations, causes of action, policies, and practices that are burdening the identification, development, siting, production, or use of domestic energy resources that are or may be unconstitutional, preempted by federal law, or otherwise unenforceable. So since then, we've seen the administration file some lawsuits against state programs. They have sued against Vermont and New York's state climate superfund laws. And they've also had 2 lawsuits preemptively challenging civil liability lawsuits by Michigan and Hawaii against fossil fuel companies. The administration proposed in August to repeal that 2009 endangerment finding that I told you about. That was the basis for regulating greenhouse gas emissions. But they do something else interesting in that proposal. We just posted a blog post yesterday about this. In addition to saying that they think EPA really cannot legally regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act, they're arguing that states are still preempted through the preemption pieces of the Clean Air Act from regulating their own state level vehicle standards for greenhouse gases. So we can't do it, but also the states still can't do it either. So it's really binding, not just what the federal government does, but the state governments might be able to do as well. That's out for comment now. If anyone wants to put in comments, they're due September 22nd. And we are largely just trying to track and see what this picture keeps looking like for states. States are in litigation. They are defending their programs. They are suing for some of these grant programs. Not all of them, of course, but many are. And a lot of them are working together to write comment letters to EPA and other agencies. Don't know how this turns out. But the piece that I would like to leave you with and open for questions is my contention that we never, we talk about this pendulum swing. It's federal, it's state, it's federal, it's state, it swings back and forth. In my argument, it's not either of those things. It's always both of those things. And that our entire system of energy law and transportation law and climate law and environmental law that this is all based on is federalist. And there is no state action that can exist without the context of federal regulation and structure and money and all the things. And there's almost no federal regulation in this area that can exist without the state role of informing and implementing and supporting the regulation of all these breaches. So that is my case to you, that the subnational piece of this is always really critically important. It is important when we have an active federal government. It is important when we have an inactive federal government. And the states right now are the ones who are really standing up and saying, we need to deal with this problem and really trying to figure out what space there is to do it. So that is my pitch for you of the value of subnational climate action. And I will stop and see if you have questions for me.
I was wondering what implications you think the backtrack of climate policy in the US might have for the US's dominance globally in the future and energy relations in that sense.
Yeah, so we go to the international FCCC climate negotiations each year as the Climate Center. Georgetown University is actually an observer in the FCCC process. We go with some other members of the Georgetown community to the COPs. And the reason that we go as a climate center is we talk about what climate action looks like in the US. And sometimes that feels really important when the US is doing a lot. Sometimes it feels really important when the US is at the federal level really not doing a lot. Because the story that we tell is kind of this story. It's the story that you may see a federal government that's not acting, but you may not see all of these state and local action that is happening. And that in many cases is the place where these regulations are adopted, is the place where these decisions are made, is the place where these investments are made. And so we try to go and tell the story that really stuff is still happening. But that really doesn't address the issue I think you're raising, which is, but this really changes the way the US shows up in an international forum. And that is undeniably true. Like we can go there and say like, it's not gone. But there's something about leadership and there's something about the federal government being the voice of what the US is doing and their commitment to it that you absolutely lose when that's not something that we are leading with.
Could you say a bit more about the city level responses to this? And I'm coming from having done research in San Antonio, Texas, with a chief resiliency officer in a state that doesn't have a chief resiliency officer, and the ways in which the city is a sub responder and what role they play in this broader framework.
Yeah, so a really important one. Like I didn't talk much about cities here. A lot of our work really focuses on the state level, but recognizing the really critical role that cities play as well. They have different levers, right? So one thing we think a lot about is like, what are the things you can do with the authority that states have? What are things you can do with the authority that local governments have? They're different things, right? I'm looking at Uwe right now because Uwe and I are both on DC's Climate Change Commission and trying to think about what the District of Columbia can do and what levers we have to reduce emissions. And they're different, right? We don't have power plants in the District of Columbia. We don't control that. We do a lot of buildings. We have laws on the books in the district that the city council has passed, the district council has passed. They're really trying to get at the emissions caused by our use of buildings. We have transportation planning that happens in the District of Columbia with a lot of opportunities to change the way people get around, but not all the ways, right? We have a lot of commuters from outside the district, in Maryland and Virginia, who we don't really get to steer in all the ways you might. And so I think it's a different set of levers, different set of choices, but still a huge opportunity for city legislatures, city councils to think about what those pieces are. I think adaptation is a huge one. A lot of adaptation is local. It's a place-based thing. The risks that you face, the vulnerabilities that you face are about where you sit. And so it's really a critical place for local governments to lead, trying to figure out what they're worried about in their communities and what they need to protect in their communities.
Kind of as a follow-on to that, looking at the regional level, given that things like adaptation and resilience do cross state boundaries because of the different climate and factors like storms, et cetera, that impact them. Can you describe if you're doing any work at the regional level to try to advance some of these things?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that's interesting is that we use the word regional in some really inconsistent ways, I'll just say, at our center. When we talk about regional in terms of emissions reductions, we tend to talk about things like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is 12 states. When we talk about regional in the adaptation setting, we tend to mean like a locality, like a city plus some suburbs and some outlying areas and a sort of general place that has its own impact, its own vulnerabilities that it's worried about in a very place-based kind of way. We do work at that scale as well. And the thing we do most at that scale is with some partners convene a group of regional climate collaboratives, which are creations of sort of local areas. It might be a city plus a county plus some other local jurisdictions trying to think through, this is what we're going to face together. It's not going to stop at the city line. It's not going to stop at our county line. How do we deal with this together? So in many, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but in many places around the country, there are these regional collaboratives where the communities of a place are getting together and talking about what impacts they are going to feel together and how they want to. So we spend a lot of time talking to them about what they're wrestling with.
So another question of scale, in addition to municipal and regional, we were looking at other places that action could show up in the relative national vacuum and maybe the preemption of state activity. What about intensely local community initiatives like community solar? Do those matter at all? And can they agglomerate? And also skipping around the other side, global, which could include multinational actors as well. What are you seeing in those spaces that might be other ways to think through this lens?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say every little bit matters. Like, this is one of the things that EPA is arguing in this new proposed engagement finding is that the slice of emissions that we get from US cars is only this little teeny tiny percent of global emissions, right? It's just the US, it's just the cars, it's just the sources, and it's so little, right? It can't possibly matter, and regulating emissions from these sources can't make a big difference in global climate change. You can do that to every single source, right? You can say that about every slice if you slice it small enough, and all the slices add up. And so it all matters. The question is sort of how do you pull the levers that enable those things to happen at scale, affordably, efficiently. We don't do a ton of work at the sort of, we ourselves don't do a ton of work at the sub-city level. We have done more adaptation work again at the sub-city level. We've worked with some of the neighborhoods in the District of Columbia on their resilience concerns and priorities and needs. We have done lots of that at the local level, but all of that. And DC has programs for homeowners and neighborhoods to take advantage of funding programs and things like that. And multinational is another place where I just don't know as much. We really focus domestically and less on corporations and more on policies, but also always important. Like they have huge levers globally for reducing emissions.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. And, as I look at this sort of checkerboard quilt of different states, some of which are surprising, right? One of the questions that I've been really struggling with is what kinds of language can we use to sort of move the levers when language like climate change and carbon emissions, won't be warmly received, right? How do we sort of speak to those communities that might be heavily impacted by our shifting climate in a way that they will sort of listen to and at least be open to?
Yeah, so that's the thing people ask themselves a lot and should ask themselves a lot, right? If you're talking to someone who's not hearing you, you're not going to get anywhere. And it's true that in many cases, words like climate change make people not hear you. We have climate change in our name, right? We're the Georgetown Climate Center. I can't avoid being associated with climate change. And we've accepted that and leaned in on it. We're not changing the name. But it's there and it changes conversations sometimes. It's important to us that we acknowledge what we're doing. But the way I talk about things changes depending on where I am. And I think that's true of everything I say and everyone I say it to. The way I think about it is listen to people and see what they care about. And if you hear what people care about, you can talk about the things that they care about. And every single one of those things they care about is affected by climate change. So if they're worried about energy bills, you can talk about energy bills. If they're worried about their basement being flooded, you can talk about their basement being flooded. The things that are the real worries of people and the priorities of people, they're worried about affordability, they're worried about safety, they're worried about access, they're worried about getting to work on time. Like those things are all really easy to talk about if you just talk about those things, and you don't need to worry about like which jargon do I pick if you just sort of see what they want to hear.
So I'm from Virginia, which has become the largest data center
Yeah.
in the country. And I'm just wondering how states are adapting to this, because if these data centers are not linked to renewable energy, they will become our largest emission sources in the future. So like, how are states proactively, dealing with this? Because I know Virginia is one of the states that has said they would be net zero, but at the same time,
Absolutely.
promoting these
So
data centers.
great question. I don't have a map for you on this yet because there's trying to figure it out. Like I feel like there will be a map of what states are doing on data centers coming soon. But right now they're just trying to figure out what is happening and what are their choices. So you see, and the problem that you're identifying is that we are predicting huge growth in energy demand from data centers and also from other sources. We have built up an industrialization in the country more in the last few years. We are electrifying transportation, we are electrifying buildings, and also building all these data centers. And so the projections for what happens to the energy demand really changed. And you have states that have clean energy goals or climate goals, and states that don't have either of those things, trying to figure out, well, what do I do? Many of them are really actively trying to draw these businesses to their states. They're potentially economic development, they're potentially jobs, potentially not jobs. But they're trying to figure out, do we want them? How many do we want? Where do we want them? How do we supply them with power if we let them, encourage them, invite them to come here? How do we supply the energy they need? And so there's a conversation partly about just how do we actually serve the demand that we're going to see, and also a conversation, how do we do that in a way that doesn't undermine our clean energy and emissions goals? And that priority balance can be different in every state, but it's a thing that we are very much actively trying to think through with states that are trying to do it in a way that doesn't undermine their climate goal. Like, what does this look like? And also to the sort of messaging point, how do you do this in a way that doesn't dramatically increase energy bills? Because the more demand there is, if there isn't supply for it, we have a really serious energy cost problem to worry about, as well as a clean problem. So I don't know the answer yet. There are several states, including Virginia, where there is legislation proposed and being explored. I think some states have passed a few things about what they expect from companies when they bring these big demand centers in. But that is very much a like front of the line, ripe question right now that I don't have the solution to.
Does the Climate Center have any engagement with First Law, Earth Law, ecological jurisprudence, rights of nature, those kinds of frameworks?
Directly at the center, less so than the law center would. We would see that more in the faculty who do research on the sort of more sort of legal academia. We are really doing sort of the apply what the states are asking us to help them do in terms of policy making. So that doesn't come into our stuff as much, but I might to our former faculty director is joining me in the back here. Peter, do you know about folks at the law center working on that?
There are a few, but it's not extensive. Maybe most of them are basically working on a science-based policy, legal analysis stuff rather than. And there's an active interest in indigenous law and how indigenous groups deal with environmental and climate issues. But I'm not aware of anybody who's doing significant work in the sort of the way you're describing rights of nature stuff. There are people in legal academia doing it, and I see their papers posted from time to time, but I'm not aware of that at Georgetown.
How are you on time here?
I have one more question.
On
On the topic of Indigenous law, you mentioned that 6 tribes lost their grant funding. Are there any other, whether flashpoints or other interactions between tribal governments in the federal government or tribal governments in the state government in regards to climate change policy?
Yeah, many. Yeah, it's extensive, right? So one, tribes are generally eligible as a similar but different entity as states and cities in these grant programs. They list eligibility for states and tribes and cities, localities generally, and sometimes different pots of money depending on the recipient. And so there has been a huge opportunity for funding going to tribes in a lot of these programs. There are also ways that tribes are sort of defined and handled and treated in terms of the regulatory balance, in terms of writing plans to implement these federal standards. So tribes are also co-regulators of all of these programs as well, and are also seeing grants get cut. They're also seeing programs that affect their own regulations and their own policies and their own initiatives in the tribe.
Let's give a final thing. And please come and join us for a happy hour on the 8th floor. You can stick around and ask us.
Yeah, I'll be there.
Questions.
Thank you all. I know.